In the quiet, remote countryside town of St. Francisville, Louisiana, the sudden death of 22-year-old Daniel Grayson shocked the small community. What seemed at first like a tragic accident on the family's large estate soon turned into a story of forbidden love, betrayal, and murder. At the center of it all was the secret affair between Daniel and his stepmother, Sophia Grayson, a relationship that led to a terrible and deadly end. Sophia was the second wife of Harold Grayson, a well-known businessman who inherited his wealth and the mansion they called home. He was older than her by nearly 20 years, which was something Sophia had always accepted in the beginning. She was drawn to the idea of stability and luxury after a rough upbringing, and Harold provided both. But over time, their relationship grew cold. Harold busy with work and Sophia left to feel like a forgotten decoration in a house far too large for the two of them. What seemed like a mundane marriage began to unravel when Harold's son from his previous marriage, Daniel, came to live with them. Daniel was everything Harold wasn't: young, charismatic, and full of life. He had just turned 22, still reeling from the sudden death of his mother, and Harold thought it would be best for him to stay with them while he sorted himself out. At first, Sophia kept her distance, treating Daniel more like a guest than a member of the family. She assumed they wouldn't have much in common. He was younger, still figuring out life, and she had settled into a monotonous routine. Days turned into weeks, and despite her initial reservations, Sophia found herself spending more time with Daniel. He was different from his father, less rigid, less preoccupied with work. His carefree nature was infectious, and slowly, an unspoken connection began to build between them. It began innocently enough, with fleeting moments that neither of them thought much of at first. Small, harmless conversations in the kitchen that stretched longer than they should have. A shared joke that made Sophia laugh in a way she hadn't in years. There was nothing overtly wrong, but there was something unspoken, simmering beneath the surface. The way Daniel would look at her, his gaze lingering just a moment too long, not as his father's wife, but as a woman. And in those moments, Sophia felt something she hadn't in a long time seen. Daniel was different from Harold in every way. Where Harold was distant, always buried in work or his own thoughts, Daniel was vibrant, full of life and attentive. His youth, his energy, it was intoxicating. Sophia had long grown used to the cold, mechanical routine of her life with Harold, but with Daniel, she felt alive again, as if something inside her had been reawakened. She felt beautiful in a way she hadn't in years, and it scared her how much she craved it. One evening, after Harold had left on another of his business trips, the house was quiet, too quiet. Sophia sat alone in the dimly lit living room, sipping a glass of wine to calm her restless mind. The weight of the silence pressed down on her, the emptiness of the house more suffocating than usual. She stared into the fire, lost in thought when she heard footsteps approaching. It was Daniel. He entered the room casually, but something in the air changed the moment he sat down beside her. He was closer than usual, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body next to hers. They exchanged glances, and in that brief moment, everything shifted. The tension between them, once subtle, was now thick, like a current pulling them towards something neither of them could stop. They talked, but the words didn't matter. It was the pauses between the words that spoke volumes, the way Daniel's eyes never left hers, the way her heart raced in her chest. Without thinking, without planning, he reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. His fingers lingered against her skin and a shiver ran down her spine. She didn't pull away. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. It was the beginning of something dangerous, something neither of them could stop now that it had started. That night, they crossed a line they could never uncross. Under the cover of darkness, with the rest of the world blissfully unaware, they gave in to the pull between them. The thrill of it was intoxicating, overwhelming. Daniel was everything Sophia had been missing. He was attentive, tender in ways Harold hadn't been in years. And for Daniel, Sophia was something forbidden, a secret thrill that made his heart race, made him feel alive in the wake of his mother's death. From that night on, they were bound together by their secret. Their encounters became more frequent, more charged with tension. Whenever Harold was away, Daniel and Sophia would steal moments together, hiding their forbidden relationship in the shadows of the sprawling estate. At first, it was cautious, furtive touches in the hallway, stolen glances across the room, but soon they grew bolder. They would meet in hidden corners of the house, in the guest house on the far side of the estate, wherever they could find a moment alone. Each time they crossed that line, it became harder to turn back. What started as an unspoken attraction had turned into something neither of them could resist. It consumed them both. The fear of being caught only heightened the excitement, made it feel like a game they were playing, a game where the stakes were growing higher with every passing day. But as the affair intensified, so did the danger. They were reckless, too caught up in each other to see the cracks forming in the fragile world they had created. Sophia knew it was wrong, knew the risk they were taking, but she couldn't stop herself. Daniel was a drug she was addicted to, and the more time she spent with him, the more she needed him. And Daniel knew the consequences too. He knew what it meant to betray his father, the man who had raised him, but he didn't care. With Sophia, he felt understood in a way no one else had ever made him feel. In her, he found solace from the pain of losing his mother, a connection that he couldn't let go of, even as it pulled him further into the darkness. However, the secrecy began to weigh on them. There was always the fear of being caught, the fear that Harold would return early one day and discover the truth. Yet, this fear only fueled their passion. The thrill of almost getting caught seemed to heighten the attraction, turning their affair into a game of risk they couldn't resist playing. But as with all things forbidden, the affair could not remain hidden forever. It started with small things, the way Harold noticed Daniel spending more time around the house, and the way Sophia seemed to be in a better mood when Daniel was around. Harold dismissed it at first, attributing it to the bond they were forming as stepmother and stepson. But then, there were the glances he noticed between them, the way they seemed to share secrets in silence. It was subtle, but Harold was not a fool. He had built his business on his ability to read people, to understand what they weren't saying. And something about the way Sophia and Daniel behaved around each other didn't sit right with him. One evening, after returning from a business trip earlier than expected, Harold overheard a conversation between them. It wasn't explicit, but there was an intimacy in their voices that unsettled him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and from that moment on, he began watching them more closely, his suspicions growing by the day. Yet, he said nothing. Not at first. Harold had always been a calculating man, and he didn't believe in confronting a situation without evidence. Instead, he started digging. He watched their every move, waiting for the moment when they would slip up. And then one night, it happened. Daniel and Sophia thought they were alone in the house, believing Harold was still away on yet another business trip. They let their guard down, meeting in secret in the guest house on the far side of the estate. It was their usual spot, far enough from the main house that no one could hear them. They were in each other's arms when they heard the front door open. Sophia froze, her heart racing. "He's back," she whispered, panic setting in. Daniel quickly grabbed his clothes, but before they could make their escape, the door to the guest house swung open, revealing Harold standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. He knew. The room was suffocatingly still as Harold stood there frozen in the doorway. Daniel and Sophia stared back at him, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a moment, no one moved, as if time itself had stopped, trapping them in a moment of unbearable tension. "Harold," Sophia finally stammered, scrambling to cover herself with the bedsheet. She looked at Daniel, her eyes wide with fear, but Daniel had gone pale, his mind racing for an escape. "What is this?" Harold's voice was low and dangerous, a quiet fury simmering beneath the surface. His eyes darted between his wife and his son, disbelief and betrayal etched into his features. I can explain," Sophia started. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew there was no explanation that could justify what Harold had just witnessed. The truth hung in the air like a guillotine, ready to drop. Daniel stepped forward, his voice cracking. "Dad, it's not what you think." "Not what I think," Harold interrupted, his voice rising with each word. "Then what is it, Daniel? What am I looking at right now? What are you two doing here together?" He took a step into the room, his fists clenched at his sides. The betrayal was cutting through him like a knife, the kind of betrayal that tore apart not just families, but lives. Sophia knew there was no escaping this now. The affair had been exposed, and there was no turning back, but she didn't realize just how far things would spiral from here. There was so much more to come. The night ended in explosive silence. Harold had stormed out of the guest house, leaving Sophia and Daniel in a mix of fear and uncertainty. They knew they couldn't just go back to the way things were. The affair had been revealed, and they had no idea how Harold would react. Sophia feared for their safety, not knowing what Harold was capable of now that his trust had been shattered. The days that followed were a painful limbo. Harold hadn't confronted them since that night, but his presence was like a dark cloud looming over the house. He acted as though nothing had happened, but Sophia could feel the simmering rage beneath his cold exterior. The tension was unbearable. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Every moment felt like it was teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. Then one evening, Harold approached her. His eyes were hollow, and his voice was icy calm. "We need to talk," he said, and for the first time in days, Sophia saw the true depth of his hurt. They sat down in the living room and Harold spoke quietly, controlled. "I don't know what you thought you were doing, Sophia, but you've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed." His voice trembled slightly, but it was laced with an undercurrent of something more. Not just betrayal, but vengeance. Sophia didn't speak. She couldn't. The guilt was a weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But Harold wasn't done. "You've made a fool of me, in my own house, with my own son." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But I'll tell you something, Sophia. I'm not a fool, and I won't let you ruin this family." She stared at him, a chill creeping up her spine. What was he saying? But Harold didn't elaborate. Instead, he stood up and left the room, leaving Sophia alone with her thoughts and her growing fear. For weeks, the house was consumed by a deadly silence. Harold and Daniel barely spoke, and when they did, it was tense and clipped. Sophia tried to act like things were normal, but it was impossible. She could feel Harold watching her, could sense that he was waiting for something, planning something, but what? One evening, Harold approached Daniel. The encounter was unexpected, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought his father might want to reconcile, to talk things out like they had before the affair. But Harold's face was cold, unreadable. "Daniel," Harold said, his voice even and steady, "we need to sort this out. You've made some serious mistakes, but you're my son. I'm willing to talk, to make things right." Daniel hesitated. He wanted to believe his father, wanted to think that maybe this nightmare could be undone. "Dad? Harold held up a hand. "Not here," he said. "Let's take a drive. Just the two of us." Daniel glanced at Sophia, who was standing in the doorway, her face pale with worry. She didn't trust Harold, not after the way he had been acting. But Daniel, desperate for some semblance of normalcy, nodded. "All right." They got into Harold's car and drove in silence for a while. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of what to expect. "Dad, about what happened," Daniel began, but Harold cut him off. "What happened?" Harold said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Was that you betrayed me, you and Sophia, you both betrayed me." Daniel's stomach tightened. He didn't know what to say, how to explain something so inexcusable. But then Harold said something that sent a chill down his spine. "We're going to fix this," Harold said, "one way or another." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Harold's eyes flicked to his son, and for the first time, Daniel saw the full extent of his father's anger. "You'll see," Harold muttered. "We'll make this right." On the other side, Sophia paced the living room, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Something wasn't right. The way Harold had taken Daniel away, the look in his eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Her heart raced, and without thinking, she grabbed her coat and keys and rushed out the door, getting into her car to follow them. As she drove, her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. What if Harold had finally snapped? What if he planned to confront Daniel in a way that wouldn't end well for either of them? The road stretched out before her, dark and winding. The rain had started again, heavy and relentless. She could barely see through the windshield, but she kept driving, her knuckles gripping the steering wheel. She had to catch up to them. She had to stop whatever was about to happen. Then up ahead she saw the faint glow of headlights. Harold's car. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. She saw them pull off the road and into the woods, the car disappearing into the trees. What were they doing out here? Why had Harold brought Daniel to such a remote place? Sophia parked her car at the edge of the road and got out, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran into the woods, the rain soaking her clothes as she stumbled over the muddy ground. The darkness closed in around her, but she could hear voices up ahead, Harold and Daniel. She slowed her pace, moving cautiously as she approached them. Harold's voice was low, menacing. "You thought you could just take everything from me, didn't you? My wife, my life. But you can't, Daniel. You won't." "Dad, please." Daniel's voice was strained, pleading. "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Sophia crept closer, staying hidden behind a tree as she listened, her heart in her throat. She could see them now, standing face to face in the clearing. Harold had something in his hand. A gun. Sophia's blood ran cold. She had to stop this. She had to do something. But before she could move, Harold spoke again, his voice filled with venom. "You ruined everything," he said. "You and her, you both ruined my life." "Dad, please." But Harold didn't give him a chance to finish. There was a deafening crack as the gun went off and Daniel collapsed to the ground. Sophia's scream echoed through the forest, piercing the silence that followed the gunshot. She ran forward, her heart shattering at the sight of Daniel lying on the wet ground, blood spreading across his chest. Harold stood over him, the gun still in his hand, his face a mask of rage mixed with something even darker, a twisted sense of justification. "No!" Sophia sobbed as she knelt beside Daniel, her hands trembling as she touched his face. His eyes were still open, shock and pain reflected in them. He was gasping, his breath shallow and labored. "Daniel, please stay with me, stay with me." But Daniel couldn't respond. His eyes fluttered, his chest rising and falling unevenly, the life slowly draining from him. Sophia could feel him slipping away, and panic took over. She pressed her hands to his wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding, but it was useless. There was too much blood, too much damage. "Why?" she screamed at Harold, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this?" Harold stared at her, his hand still gripping the gun tightly, his knuckles white. There was no remorse in his eyes, no regret for what he had just done. "He betrayed me," Harold said, his voice cold and emotionless. "You both betrayed me." "But he's your son," Sophia cried. "How could you kill your son?" Harold shook his head slowly, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "He stopped being my son the moment he touched you." Sophia's sobs grew louder as she cradled Daniel's head in her lap, watching helplessly as his breathing grew weaker. His eyes, once so full of life, were now dull, his gaze unfocused. She could feel the last remnants of life leaving him, and in that moment she felt her heart break in two. "But there's more," Harold said, his voice disturbingly calm. "This isn't just about Daniel. It's about you too, Sophia." Sophia looked up at him, fear gripping her as she saw the glint in his eyes. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Harold took a step closer, lowering the gun slightly but still holding it in his hand. "You thought you could ruin me, didn't you?" he said, his tone dark and menacing. "You thought you could betray me with my son and walk away unscathed. But that's not how this works." Sophia's breath caught in her throat as Harold knelt beside her, his face inches from hers. "You're just as guilty as he is, Sophia," he said softly. "And now you're going to pay for what you've done." Panic surged through her as she realized what Harold intended to do. He wasn't finished. Killing Daniel wasn't enough for him. He wanted revenge, complete and total retribution for the betrayal he believed he had suffered. And now, he was going to take it out on her. Sophia scrambled backward, her hand slipping in the mud as she tried to distance herself from him. "Please, Harold, don't do this," she begged, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." But Harold didn't listen. He raised the gun again, pointing it directly at her. "It's too late for that," he said, his eyes cold and unforgiving. Sophia's mind raced. She had to think of something, anything to stop him. Her gaze flicked to Daniel's lifeless body, and the overwhelming grief she felt threatened to consume her. But then something inside her shifted. A wave of fury surged through her. Fury at Harold, at the man who had taken everything from her, at the man who had just murdered the person she had come to love. She wasn't going to let him win. Without thinking, Sophia lunged forward, grabbing Harold's wrist in a desperate attempt to wrestle the gun from his hand. They struggled, both of them slipping in the mud as they fought for control of the weapon. Harold was stronger, but Sophia was fueled by a raw, primal rage that gave her the strength to fight back. "Let go!" Harold shouted, his voice strained as he tried to shake her off. But Sophia held on, her nails digging into his skin as she fought with everything she had. The gun went off again, the sound deafening in the quiet forest. But this time, it wasn't Daniel or Sophia who was hit. Harold gasped, his eyes widening in shock as blood began to pour from a wound in his side. He stumbled backward, clutching at his abdomen as he dropped the gun to the ground. Sophia stared at him, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline. She hadn't meant to pull the trigger, she hadn't even realized what she was doing. But now, Harold was the one bleeding out in front of her. "You," Harold croaked, his voice weak as he fell to his knees. "You shot me." Sophia didn't move. She stood frozen, watching as the man who had once been her husband, the man who had brought her into his life, now lay dying at her feet. She felt no sympathy, no remorse, only a cold, hollow emptiness inside her. Harold collapsed onto the ground, his breathing ragged. His eyes met Sophia's one last time, filled with disbelief and hatred, and then, with one final, shuddering breath, he was gone. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The rain continued to fall, but Sophia didn't notice. She stood there, numb and unfeeling, staring at the two bodies in front of her. Everything that had happened, the affair, the lies, the betrayal, the murder, it all felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But the nightmare was real. She had lost everything. Daniel, Harold, her life as she knew it. It was all gone, destroyed in a single terrible night. The weight of it all came crashing down on her, and she sank to the ground, her hands trembling as she buried her face in them. She didn't cry. She couldn't. There were no tears left. For what felt like hours, she sat there motionless, her mind blank. She didn't know what to do or where to go. The house, Harold's house, felt like a prison now, a place filled with memories that she could never escape from. She couldn't stay there, not after everything that had happened. Finally, she stood up, her body aching from the cold and the rain. She glanced one last time at the bodies of Harold and Daniel, a wave of sadness washing over her. But there was no turning back now. What was done, she couldn't change any of it. Sophia walked back to her car in a daze, her mind still numb as she climbed into the driver's seat. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay there, not with the ghosts of her past haunting her every step. But as she started the car and pulled onto the road, one thought kept echoing in her mind. What would happen next? How could she possibly explain what had happened? 2 people were dead, one of them at her own hands. The police would come. Questions would be asked. And the truth, the terrible, sordid truth, would come out. Sophia drove for hours, the rain beating down on the car as she tried to think of a plan. She knew the police would find the bodies eventually. They would know what had happened. But would they believe her story? Would they understand that she had acted in self-defense? Or would they see her as just another guilty party in a twisted love affair that had gone wrong? She didn't know. When she finally reached a small, isolated motel on the outskirts of a town miles away, she pulled into the parking lot and sat there, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She looked like a ghost, a shell of the woman she had once been. Sophia checked into the motel under a false name, paying in cash to avoid leaving a trail. Inside the small, dimly lit room, she collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion finally overtaking her. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind was plagued with images of that night, the sound of the gunshots echoing in her ears. She knew she couldn't run forever. Eventually, the truth would catch up to her. The police would find her, and she would have to face the consequences of what she had done. But for now, all she wanted was a few moments of peace, a few moments where she didn't have to think about what had happened. Sophia had been on the run for weeks, but in the end, it was inevitable. The police found her through DNA left at the scene, traces of her struggle with Harold, fingerprints on the gun. It didn't take long for them to piece together what had happened that night in the woods. She was arrested quietly, without resistance, and in the trial that followed, the truth of the affair and the murders came to light. The media had a field day, painting her as the villain in a twisted love triangle. Sophia pleaded guilty to manslaughter, admitting that she had shot Harold in self-defense after he killed Daniel. The judge was lenient, considering the circumstances, but it didn't matter. Sophia was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Now, sitting in her cold cell, Sophia reflected on how it had all unraveled. The affair, the betrayal, the murder. It had destroyed everything. 6 years didn't feel like enough to atone for what she had done, but it was her reality now.